Yeah, hello everybody, and welcome to this live stream from Love Ballarat. I'd like to first acknowledge during Reconciliation Week the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Wadawurrung people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm Peter Freund, and I've lived in Ballarat for more than 30 years, and I've been involved in various branches of the arts ever since that time. And for a lot of the time I was working at Her Majestys Theatre, and during that time, part of my brief allowed me to investigate aspects of theatre history in Ballarat. So I've put together resources and built up a sort of body of knowledge over that time. And even though I'm not actively involved in the theatre at the moment, I've been asked to come along to talk to theatre history in Ballarat and share some of that with you. And so I don't have access to my bank of images at the moment, and so I'm not going to do a PowerPoint sort of prepared talk. So what I thought would be good is actually to undertake a conversation. So I've invited Katrina Hill from Love Ballarat to come along and ask me questions, and we'll engage in a conversation about early history of theatre in Ballarat. So Katrina, what do you want to know?
I would like you, Peter, to tell us about the very, very early days of theatre. So start when gold was discovered, maybe a couple of years after that. So about 1854, what was going on? Well,
by 1854, there was actually a pretty well-developed theatre industry in Ballarat. Gold discovered late in 1851. It's not entirely clear when the first theatrical activity took place. There's various accounts. But it seems to be in late 1852 into 1853 that performers started appearing in Ballarat. You've got to recognise, I guess, that there was a large population of people hanging around, going down mines and digging up nuggets or whatever they were doing, and nothing much else to do. There was money here, and so it attracted a whole lot of service industries, including theatre and performance. A lot of what we know, there's a lack of documentation, but there's some, but a lot of what we know is dependent on accounts and recollections of people in the 1880s and 1890s, looking back at the very early days of Ballarat and putting together their memories of what happened in the various goldfields theatres and some of the stories and famous performers and amusing anecdotes that took place during that time.
Okay, so then was theatre reserved for only those who were quite wealthy or for everyone?
Well, you did have to have money to attend, but it wasn't particularly expensive. And theatres were divided up into different areas. So you could have very cheap access to theatre by standing in the pit.
So the pit's down at the front?
The pit's down in the body of the theatre, whatever the shape of the theatre is. And then you might have a circle of some sort, which would be a sort of privileged area with seating, whether that be bench seating in the very rudimentary theatres or, as it evolved, plush upholstery seating. And that's for the wealthy elite. And then the top level, if the theatre's big enough, would be the upper circle. There may be other levels beyond that, but generally there would be an upper circle, and that would be also cheap seats. You're further removed, and it was notorious. That was the gallery, and you'd have sort of the local rowdies, the local youths who'd get there regularly, and they would be ready to misbehave from the gallery. So the gallery thugs sort of ready to throw things down onto the stage and interrupt performances, and that was very, very abusive. But that was basically the structure of theatres right through from 19th century through into sort of mid 20th century.
So the audience was really a part of the show, and the actors on stage knew that.
Oh yeah, very much so. Yeah. In fact, there's accounts of there wasn't a strict dividing line necessarily. I mean, in slightly earlier theatres, you'd have boxes that actually came down on either side of the stage, and you'd have people, when you're looking at the stage, you'd be seeing people on either side looking down Yeah, in the proscenium arch, there'd be actually seats up there.
Right.
When we're talking mid-19th century theatres, those theatres had those sort of boxes in those positions. So in earlier theatres, in some ways, you also had thrusts coming out, and so the performance is, there's not that fourth wall dividing window of the invisible line between the audience and the action, and people recognise that the audience was generally in light, so they were part of the performance, and you know, there's accounts of, say, in the Theatre Royal in Ballarat in the 1860s. There's you know, accounts of the villain draws a gun on the hero or whatever, and there's yelling from some guy yells from the audience, shoot him, or you know, that people actually went up onto the stage to get involved in the action because they got so involved and didn't necessarily understand that division between a passive participant and the active actors on the stage. They saw themselves as actors in some ways, as just as much they were involved and alive. So, and theatres weren't those sort of quiet, respectful places. You know, they often at the back of theatres of the circle or the back of the pit, there'd be a promenade area where you could actually go and hang around, walk around. Often prostitutes would be hanging around there, and they'd be taking the opportunity of meeting up with their customers and their clients. The front stalls were sort of a notorious area for that sort of activity, the seating or standing at the front of the stalls.
What, when did that change happen? I mean, I'm not talking about the prostitutes here. I'm talking about what changed in theatres. So I guess the audience stopped shouting at the performers and they started being quiet.
Well, I think partly technology and the introduction of electric light, where you could actually modify the lights in the auditoriums to actually put the audience into darkness. There was also, and linked with that, perhaps the start of naturalism in theatre, where the structure of what was being portrayed on the stage it's no longer being directed out and being, you know, performers would generally, you know, open out the performance to the audience and as much as possible. Whereas in the naturalism of the late 19th century, it really, you had very sort of intense, often domestic dramas. You think Ibsen and people like that.
Fourth wall.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so you need any interpretation from the audience becomes something that disrupts the whole experience and destroys the whole experience for everyone else, and people don't appreciate it. And then, I mean, there's a tension, I think, within the audience of people who still have the same sort of expectations, but it became then the convention of the fourth wall, and the codes of behaviour became much stronger.
You mentioned the Theatre Royal. I keep saying Royal. It's Theatre Royal.
Theatre Royal. Yeah.
Whereabouts was that?
Okay, so that's a really interesting theatre. I mean, so there was a whole period of sort of 8 years or so. Theatre Royal opened at the end of 1858 in Sturt Street in Ballarat, in the main part of the town, and that was, I guess, really significant because in the sort of 7 or 8 years leading up to that, the activity had been down on the flat in the main road area leading down to the Geelong Road. And the theatre district had been down there very much, but it wasn't an ideal area for a number of reasons for any commercial activity, because it was too unstable. There was mining activity potentially undermining roads. There was the danger of fire was the chief impediment to that sort of building up that activity along the old main road. There were a series of disastrous fires through the 1850s and into the 1860s, and a lot of the old Goldfields theatres in that entertainment area were sort of wiped out at that time. So it became much more that the established activity, whether that be commercial or theatrical, would take place up on the plateau, where there was planned streets and far less danger of disruption. So if you built something there, you'd know it would survive. It would know it would be stable.
Yeah.
And so the whole focus of activity moved up the hill onto the plateau. So Sturt Street, if you imagine next to Myers, there was a hotel where Myers was, the publican owned a block next to it.
Okay.
And he sold that block to a very keen group of theatrical, or people who were keen on theatre, to build the Theatre Royal. So that was a huge, just unbelievably ambitious project, really. It was the first theatre in permanent building materials in mainland Australia. It was built at a cost of, I think, £13,000, just an astronomical amount.
So £13,000, how much would that be today?
I don't know, a lot of money, a lot of money.
We're talking millions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not millions. But,
Not millions?
well, maybe. But
Maybe.
so there was a very passionate group who partly they believed in Ballarat, and I guess there was a tendency, as other rushes would crop up, for activity to move elsewhere, and putting down roots as a community sort of solidified your investment in this place. So things like theatres and institutions then turned into cities or towns or cities. So it guarded against that instability of everyone going off to the next rush.
Yeah.
So you put down roots, you establish yourself, and Ballarat had the start of that. So this group of passionate people, led by a very interesting guy called William Maxwell Brown, who was a local stationer, but also an amateur performer and amateur playwright from back in England. Mm-hmm. He led this group to build the Theatre Royal with nowadays you have to have a business plan and all that sort of stuff behind it. All they had was passion and belief, and they managed to get people on board. They engaged architects. They built this thing. It was a public liability company, and so they got all the people to invest in it. They sold no more than a quarter of the shares available it was underinvested in. They were constantly having problems with it. Within a year, that company had wound up. The building was sold, and it is as if right through the history of the Theatre Royal, which went from 1858 to 1878 or so, there was just a constant series of financial difficulties, because really the problem was it was built on a faulty model, that you'd have a theatre with a permanent theatre company, a stock company of actors, and you'd bring in visiting stars, but you'd have a resident company. And the cost of that was just huge. Couldn't be sustained it could be sustained in a provincial town in England, which is the model that these people had in mind. That's the places they come from. They knew theatre, they knew the business of theatre, but it was reliant on that much larger population, and it just couldn't be sustained here, particularly once the railway came to Ballarat, and you had touring companies coming out of Melbourne, which were much more viable. So having the Theatre Royal, it did eventually turn into a touring house and basically be available for rental by visiting companies. Yeah. But it's a really interesting time of seeing the possibility of the Ballarat stage as an entity and as an institution, and having its own identity, as represented by the Theatre Royal, and the sort of disastrous result of that dream. But it was an amazing, three-level playhouse, very much a playhouse. Her Majestys built 1870s, much longer auditorium, much more suited to musical presentations and bigger sort of theatre from that sort of late 19th century, a lot more opera, a lot more musical, a lot more pantomime and that style of stuff. But the Theatre Royal was very much a result of the days of theatre. And it was a stage house, a playhouse, dominated by the very first manager was Billy Hoskins, who was a well-known Shakespearean comedian, and that was the focus of his company. And it was very much a playhouse, and it had opera as well. His wife, Hoskins's wife, was an opera singer, and there was a huge variety of stuff presented there. But really, the bones of the heart of it was Shakespeare and the other playwrights of the sort of English drama.
So it's so fascinating. The Theatre Royal would have competed with other theatres in town at the time.
To some degree, not really, because by that stage the life had gone out of the Ballarat East, the main road experience. For a couple of years there was competition. Then 1861, big fire went through, knocked out basically the three surviving theatres that were still down on the old main road.
That would have been the Adelphi.
Well, it was the Victoria by that stage.
Victoria?
The Adelphi had become the Victoria.
Yep.
The Montezuma.
Yep.
And the Charlie Napier.
Yeah, right.
And each of those old goldfields theatres in the 1850s had their own identity and their own strengths. Particularly the Montezuma was perhaps the sort of most related to the Theatre Royal, because it was the leading, sort of the snobbiest, I suppose, the place where the biggest stars would go. It had Shakespeare and drama and that sort of stuff. Charlie Napier had its own distinctive character because it had a very large auditorium with a large flat floor, which was cleared every night, and they'd have dance basically after the shows. They'd have dancing into the early hours.
Yep.
It was really notorious for the fact that the Red Hill zone of where the Red Lion Hotel is, basically the Red Hill zone of the main road, which was the theatre district, just around the corner from what's now York Street, so then Esmond Street, which was the notorious red light district. And so there was an intimate connection between the theatres and prostitution. And Charlie Napier was the sort of centre of that. The Victoria Theatre had sort of all sorts of other mixed stuff. That's the place that Lola Montez appeared at, a very famous name, of course. But anyway, to get back to your question, yes, the Theatre Royal was in competition with those theatres for a period. They all wiped out in the big, massive fire of 1861. And then there was an attempt, particularly, there was a lot of the Ballarat East businessmen who were resentful of the move back up the hill and desperately trying to retain the energy of the old main road. Yeah. And they then invested in replacing the Charlie Napier with building a massive, permanent theatre in permanent materials with a cafe at the front, which they, rather than going down the path of the Charlie Napier, which was so well known, such a well-known brand, they actually tried to sort of match the Theatre Royal, and they called it the New Adelphi Theatre. So sort of harking back to another early Goldfields Theatre, was the New Adelphi, and it was basically, it was a failure virtually from the start, and the first manager had been working with Hoskins at the Theatre Royal, and once it went broke the first time, the people were saying, oh, he was just there to undermine the business of the Theatre Royal. And I guess that might have been the perception, but it was really the model had changed. The sort of life had gone out of the vigorous main road activity, and it probably wasn't attractive place for audiences to go to. This was where it was up on the hill was where it was happening, and there was no competition really further until it got to the point where the Theatre Royal, its facilities, its infrastructure, became dated very, very quickly because of that sort of change in the style of what was most popular in theatre, drama, and even comedy drama was there, but where the big focus became on musical performance and pantomime comedy and all that sort of stuff. They needed bigger auditoriums, they needed facilities to put musicians, but they also needed flying facilities. So you'd need to have stage facilities which had the ability to fly scenery and more complex type of scenery than had been the case in the 1850s when the Theatre Royal was built. Now the Theatre Royal, the structure of it was that there was a cafe at the front, and there was actually a hotel in the building and kitchens down in the basement. But the area above the stage was actually hotel bedrooms and I think presumably stage dressing rooms as well. And so there was no capacity to fly scenery, and then there was no fly tower or equivalent. I mean, Her Majesty's, when it was built, didn't have a fly tower as such, but it had capacity in the roof to be able to fly scenery. And that's what the visiting companies needed. That's what the Theatre Royal or whoever company was coming up from Melbourne expected to have a level of stage infrastructure So it became to the point, it got to the point where once the Academy of Music, what became Her Majesty's, was built, the Theatre Royal, there was no place for that anymore. It staggered on for about another 3 years. But then it was overtaken by the Academy of Music as the focus for theatre activity, because the Academy of Music was where the visiting companies could go. And I give, the advantage of the Theatre Royal, it assumed that was a stock company, a resident company. They would just shape their performances for the facilities they had and for the limitations of their theatre. But once you got to the point where theatre was being dominated, professional theatre was dominated by touring companies. Yeah. So we just had to question, what's the most gruesome or shocking tale from the Goldfields Theatre time? That might take a bit of thinking about, but I mean, there are all sorts of little anecdotes that appear in these reminiscences, I suppose. One that occurs to me was, I think it was the Charlie Napier. They had a company come in there and they did these pose plastique, which were basically tableaus. And so there was a company that came and did a pose plastique. One of the scenes was Venus rising from the waves. And so you had all these basically naked women on stage, and it was on a basic revolve. And but the pin that held the revolve then snapped, and so you had all these naked women sliding off the stage. The account that I've read ended up that Venus herself, who was a rather large lady, ended up smashing the cello. That's awesome. But there was another incident, I think, at the Victoria Theatre where there was a melodrama with a villain and someone being about to be arrested, or a story about a highwayman, and actually the villain of the story was actually being the actor playing the villain was actually being chased by the police. And so in the middle of the performance, the stage was then invaded by police who promptly arrested him and hauled him off in handcuffs.
Fantastic.
But I guess the biggest incident, I suppose, was the sort of the famous Theatre Royal riot of it's a long time since I looked at this, but early 1870s. And there was a company had set up, there was a marionette company had come to town. They set up on the stage of the Theatre Royal, and they hadn't really checked the sight lines. And so they weren't really aware of the fact that the gallery boys right up in the top of the theatre couldn't see the marionettes, the sort of little puppets on the stage. And so the gallery boys then basically kicked up a riot and tore the place apart. And they ended up throwing stuff down. They went down to Sturt Street and got sort of rotten vegetables, ended up rotten cabbages being thrown down onto the stage. There was apparently a dead possum, which appeared from the gallery, and they sort of came down. They tore the puppet show apart. The theatre caretaker had to defend himself with a chair. And then the mob then chased the performing troupe down Sturt Street, and they had to I think went into a hotel and found somewhere to hide before they insisted on having a police presence, and they sort of put together their show and continued the performance. But that was probably the sort of notorious incident in the third, and it sort of showed that both the investment that people had in the performance and the involvement they had in the performance, and it was a rough town. It was a mining town, and people were it was that sort of place.
Not much has changed. You are an expert in Her Majesty's Theatre. Can you tell us about Her Maj?
Her Maj, right? Yeah. Okay, so Her Maj was snobby from the start, I have to say. So the Academy of Music, it was basically a very deliberate choice not to call it a theatre, because theatre was, it had connotations of the association with prostitution. It had, inevitably, theatres would have bars, and they were lively places. And the Academy of Music aimed, the alternative would have been to call it an opera house, as there were a lot of theatres of this sort of style in America, right across America, being called opera houses, or Academy of Music was a very popular term in the United States. There'd be little towns right across the United States which would have their Academy of Music. There's a Brooklyn Academy of Music now, but it really meant something. It meant that it was a theatre, but it was really geared to music performance, particularly opera, and that they made a very deliberate choice in constructing the Academy of Music, that it only had two levels. The gallery wasn't there. So the cheapest seats, where the roughest, the gallery boys would sit up the top, there was actually no place for them.
Yeah,
so the cheapest seats in the Academy of Music were the back of the stalls. And it was on the flat floor. You could actually keep control much better.
Yeah.
And what was the dress circle was called the Paradis. I'm not sure how they'd pronounce it, the Paradis or the Paradis. And so that's where the elite of the town sort of paraded in their silks and satins and whatever. But in effect, when 25 years or so later, when they redeveloped into Her Majesty's and refitted the whole building, sort of tore out the guts of it and rebuilt it from the inside. They got rid of the name Academy of Music because it was sort of confusing and odd by that stage. It hadn't taken off in Australia in the same way that it had in the United States, and people were just confused by it. So it became then Her Majesty's Theatre, which it was for many, a long time. But it did reinstate the gallery and the cheap seats, and they'd still have, as early theatres had indeed, separate entrances for the different classes. So you'd have the main entrance, which would take you right through to the stalls, and then there'd be a separate level for the gallery. So the different social classes didn't even have to mingle. But the Academy of Music, come Her Majesty's Theatre, never had a bar either. So right from the start, it was really a sort of teetotal place. Someone's just asked about Mark Twain. Indeed, it was a huge visit. And I guess Mark Twain brings in the Mechanics' Institute. Yeah. In looking at the history of Her Majesty, the Academy of Music back in 1875 when it opened, at one point I did an analysis of the Academy of Music, the Theatre Royal, and the Mechanics, and looked at the level of activity, just the nightly activity that took place at each of those places. And it turned out that the Mechanics Institute was actually the busiest place of entertainment in Ballarat. And partly because it had more of a community focus, and they presented more of a range of activities. So you'd have lectures and improving talks, but you'd also have smaller, lower scale theatrical performance, sort of in the old days, what had been the concert halls down on the main road, where you just have a singer and some musicians. That sort of performance could easily happen here, and you didn't need the complex stage machinery of the Academy of Music. So, yeah, the Mechanics was a really, really important place of entertainment, and for a whole variety of things. And Mark Twain, it was big news, but he was one of many. People were coming through all the time. There was, massive touring circuits and a lot of touring business.
You spent 3 or 5 days here?
A few days, I couldn't.
And then headed off to Warrnambool, I think.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, you're obviously...
That's all I know. And he was very impressed with Ballarat. That's
yes, and William Little, the mayor of the time, came and did a sort of a personal tour of the place, I think, and showed him around. And basically sprouted about Ballarat and how wonderful it was. And I guess Ballarat's always had a pretty sort of... Well, Ballarat's ruling classes, I guess, have always had a very firm belief in Ballarat's sort of destiny as a place. And then, that goes back to that decision to invest in the Theatre Royal, and invest in other theatres, invest in the gallery, invest in cultural infrastructure, because there's a self-belief and a belief in the place that it's an important place and deserves all these amazing facilities. Someone's just asked about the sloping stage at Her Majesty's Theatre, which is known as a rake. Yep. A raked stage. And that's to do with sightlines. So you basically, it's putting the performance on display.
So if you're sitting at the back?
Yeah, then you can see right through to the back of the stage. Otherwise, you'd see less and less the further back on stage you got.
I have one question.
If there's time.
Yeah, I think we're going to finish with this question. Gloria the ghost at Her Majesty's. Fake or real?
Oh, fake. Absolutely fake. It was a very deliberate. Edwin Ralph, the first director, when the theatre reopened in 1989, invented Gloria. He said, we need a ghost, we'll call it Gloria. And he invented this elaborate backstory that partly reflected his own backstory. So it was a very cute sort of decision, but yeah.
That's awesome. All right.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Katrina, for engaging in this conversation. Thanks, everybody.
My little girl was talking. She said, I need a glass of water. Need a glass of water for myself. I said, look in the well, baby. Ain't no water yet left on the shelf, oh no. She said, oh yes, I need $100. Oh baby, I need $100. Oh yes, need $100. Bring my baby home.